Hello, sport. So, it's chapter 3, and what do we get in this chapter? Another party. That's the third party in as many chapters so far. Do these people do anything else? Actually, they do. As Nick tells us at the end of the chapter when he says these parties were merely casual events in a crowded summer. Nick actually tells us that he was incredibly lonely most of the time, just working, eating, walking, reading, much of this alone. He tells us that he felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and other times he was wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. He even walks through New York City in the evenings and imagines himself in relationships with women that he passes by. Of course, as we'll discuss later, he has several reasons not to feel so lonely at times. So it's really because of the uniqueness of these three parties that he ends up spending so much time talking about them. And in chapter 3, we're finally invited inside of Gatsby's home. Yet Gatsby's party is starkly different from the other two. First, Nick is the only guest who seems to have been invited. Everyone else just shows up to Gatsby's mansion on the weekends. Nick has seen Gatsby's parties from his lawn, watching the fruit and caterers, decorators, musicians, the alcohol, and loads of guests from the city crawl there. Nick, in fact, opens the chapter with a long description of the party setup and cleanup, mostly to show us how over the top the whole ordeal is. This is not all that different than a sort of catalog or lengthy list that's traditionally given in epic poetry, but we'll really see this in action in chapter 4. When Nick actually goes to the party, he's impressed, or disgusted, at how riotous the whole thing is. He says the guests conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with amusement parks, which shows you a lot about how these new money parties like Gatsby's bring out the true party animal spirit in people. Carraway actually gives a lot of attention toward describing how vivid and chaotic the party scene actually is. Everyone is getting drunk. Carraway himself says he's practically on his way there before he runs into Jordan Baker, and he tries to capture the whole party scene with run-on sentences and sprawling paragraphs, telling us that laughter is easier, minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly and swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident girls who weave here and there among the stouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of a group, and then, excited with triumph, glide on through the seachange of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. There's a lot of laughter and happy socializing, but also a heavy air of superficiality. And in the midst of this, Carraway finally gets his chance to attend one of Gatsby's parties. He's certainly been watching these galas from the sideline. I mean, how could he miss it? He's Gatsby's neighbor. But in this chapter, he tells us of his first night actually inside of Gatsby's mansion. And I'm sure we've all been in those situations where we don't know anybody in a social setting and it's pretty awkward. Nick finds himself in that scenario, wandering around and watching the action unfold around him until he runs into Jordan Baker. And then his evening really gets started. Jordan temporarily ditches the East Egg folks she came with and takes Nick to begin searching for Gatsby. They search for him because there's one clear point that Nick emphasizes throughout the chapter. No one really knows who Gatsby is. Rumors about him being a murderer, a spy, a soldier, an Oxford grad all swirl around, and even by the end of the party, the only thing people know about him is that he is basically a non-person who hosts really good parties. And then we're struck with a really interesting scene. As Jordan and Nick search, they end up in the library where they have an extremely interesting conversation with a man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles, who is also very drunk. What stands out right away is the focus on his eyes, which ties back to Eckelberg's eyes from chapter 2. And beyond that, this man, who we'll call Owl Eyes, actually sees something about Gatsby that no one else does. He sees the entire persona of Gatsby as a performance. He's impressed that the books are not fake, calling Gatsby a regular Belasco, an allusion to a big-time producer in their era. Owl Eyes, despite being drunk for a week, alleges that he can see through Gatsby's performance and hints that there may be something very different beneath the feverish guise he portrays. Even though Owl Eyes says this in a sort of drunken ramble, when Nick finally does meet Gatsby later in the chapter, he gets the feeling that Gatsby is putting on a sort of act. Nick says Gatsby has an elaborate formality of speech, and he's picking his words with care. He even remembers that Jordan didn't believe much of Gatsby's backstory. All this reminds us of what Nick says about Gatsby in chapter 1, which was, if a personality is unbroken series of successful gestures, then there is something gorgeous about him. At any rate, Gatsby has an incredible smile, doesn't drink, and doesn't engage in any of the frivolity of his guests. Nick says he was happy looking from one group to another with approving eyes. These bizarre descriptions, along with Gatsby taking mysterious phone calls from various cities, only deepens the mysterious aura surrounding him. But what really draws us in by the end of the party is that Jordan Baker is pulled away and spends almost an hour speaking with Gatsby privately. When she comes out, she only reports that she heard the most amazing thing. And we, along with Nick, are left somewhat bedazzled by this wealthy and mysterious man called Gatsby. I do especially love the ending of this chapter. Like the ending of any party, there are couples fighting with each other, people stumbling around, people sleeping on the floor, and of course, there is one of the best drunk driving scenes in all of literature where a wheel falls off of a car and the driver still insists on driving it. There's initial confusion about this incident. Even though Owl Eyes is drunk and his initial statements are confusing, it turns out that he wasn't the one who was driving. And driving is actually brought up again moments later when Nick tells us about how careless of a driver Jordan Baker is. Baker dismisses this, of course, and responds with an important insight. It takes two people to make an accident. It's interesting that we have two overlapping moments of confusion about driving and discussion of accidents. Nick concludes by talking about how he realizes how dishonest of a person Jordan Baker actually is. He recalls an incident when she had allegedly cheated at a golf tournament, and he pronounces her incurably dishonest. But at the same time, he seems to be spending more time with Jordan as the summer goes on, and he tells us, I wasn't actually in love, but I felt a sort of tender curiosity. Nick ends the chapter by contrasting Jordan's dishonesty to himself. He states that he believes he is one of the few honest people he has ever known. Even though he is sort of dating Jordan, he also confesses he's still writing love letters to some girl back home who he has no further interest in, which ties back to what he cryptically said to Tom and Daisy in chapter 1 about escaping the Midwest in part to get away from a girl he didn't want to marry. So is this his way of breaking up with someone? He just moves away but continues to lead them on? Oh, Nick. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed what I believe to be one of the most fun and diverse chapters, and there is so much more to go. Until then, see ya, old sport.